Haste is a primarily red keyword ability. After all, red is the color of impulse and aggression, and haste allows a creature to attack the turn it comes down. However, while haste is primarily a red ability, black and green cards also receive the keyword fairly regularly, and even blue and white have a few cards packing the keyword. Since haste is so closely associated with red, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at non-red cards with haste. I did exclude one category of haste-granting cards though. Those that animate lands, like Nissa who shakes the world, who can do it with her +1 ability. Green land animation cards virtually always grant haste. This is because, if you aren't careful, you can end up with a double feel bad when you animate a land. This is because if you animate a land that has just entered the battlefield and it doesn't have haste, it can't attack or produce mana once it's a creature. So they add this effect to land animation so it doesn't really matter what land you reanimate. In other words, these effects never grant haste in a meaningful way. They are just insurance if a player wasn't careful about choosing a land that was already in play before the turn they used the ability. Still, after excluding this type of effect, there are 189 non-red cards in Magic that have or grant haste, and some of them are really strong. And in this video, we'll take a look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Regional Championships. At number 10, it's Goryo's Vengeance. For 1 generic and a black, it's an instant that reanimates a legendary creature from your graveyard. It makes this list because it also grants that creature haste, and then you exile the creature at the beginning of the next instep. It's also got the arcane subtype, and you can splice it onto other arcane spells for 2 generic and a black. This means you can reveal it from your hand as you cast another arcane spell and put Goryo's Vengeance's text on the spell you're casting, while still holding on to Goryo's Vengeance in your hand. There is a whole subcategory of black reanimation spells that grant haste, but then the creature gets sacrificed or exiled at the end of the turn, and that's a pretty neat way to use the keyword because it lets you reanimate something and swing with it once. So you can cast these effects super efficiently, like they did with Goryo's Vengeance. While Goryo's Vengeance is kind of restrictive about what you can reanimate, only legendary creatures, it's also an instant, unlike most reanimation spells, and that matters in one really big way. It's one of the few ways you can reanimate Emrakul the Aeon's Torn and other legendary creatures that shuffle themselves into your library when they go to the graveyard. You can cast Vengeance in response to the trigger and swing once with the 15/15 with Annihilator 6, which in the early game usually means your opponent sacrifices all of their permanents. It also commonly brings back Atraxa or Gristlebrand, and those are also creatures that give you tons of value by entering and swinging a single time too, even if they don't necessarily end the game on the spot like Emrakul does. While the whole splice onto arcane thing isn't always a big deal, it does matter sometimes, either because you've got 2 Goryo's Vengeances in hand or through the Breach, another arcane spell that's all about attacking once with a crazy strong creature. Goryo's Vengeance has gained most of its points in modern reanimator decks, and it's going to continue to be a factor in the format. Being the best way in the format to reanimate Emrakul is always going to let it remain relevant. At number 9, it's Fleetwheel Cruiser. For 4 generic, it's a 5/3 vehicle with trample and haste, and when it enters, it becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. It also has crew 2. So, the turn this comes down, you don't have to crew it for it to smash in for 5, which is pretty sweet, and the crew cost later in the game isn't too bad, especially when you factor in getting a 5/3 with trample and haste for a turn. It saw play in a variety of aggro decks while it was in standard, including vehicle decks that could make it even bigger with veteran motorist and other payoffs. However, it's actually seen the most play in Magic's most powerful format, Vintage. Fleetwheel Cruiser has got to be one of the cards people are most surprised to hear that it's been heavily played in Magic's most powerful format, so let me explain how such a thing could possibly happen. Its vintage points have all come in Shops decks. These are mono artifact decks that use lots of fast mana, most notably Mishra's Workshop, to power out lots of artifacts. The hyper-aggressive variants that have used the Cruiser are amusingly called Car Shops. Anyway, in that deck, playing a turn 1 Fleetwheel Cruiser or even multiples is doable, so you can get in for tons of damage early. And thereafter, it also provides an evasive body that triggers all your other artifact synergies, and the deck has plenty of creatures that can crew it too. While the cruiser saw play in Vintage for about 7 years, it hasn't put up any top 8s in Vintage or any format since 2023, so it may not be on this list for much longer. At number 8, it's Strangleroot Geist. For 2 green, it's a 2/1 with Haste and Undying. That means when it dies, if it doesn't have a +1/+1 counter on it, you return it to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. The Geist is super efficient, since you pay 2 mana and end up getting a 2/1 and a 3/2 in the end, and it has Haste both times. It saw play in Gruul aggro decks in both block and standard entirely because of its impressive efficiency, but then it went idle for about half a decade, until Yawgmoth Thran Physician was printed in Modern Horizons. Since the advent of Yawgmoth, Strangleroot Geist has been a fixture in modern combo decks that look to combine the two of them in a game-winning combo. This is possible because of how +1/+1 and -1/-1 counters interact. When a creature with Undying dies, it comes back to the battlefield from the graveyard with that +1/+1 counter. Then the next time it dies, it's supposed to stay dead because it has a counter on it, but that's not true if you use Yawgmoth's ability to put a -1/-1 counter on the Undying creature. The two counters cancel each other out, so now you can just sacrifice Strangleroot Geist as many times as you want. You do need 2 Undying creatures in play alongside Yawgmoth to pull it off, and a creature like Zulaport Cutthroat in play to kill your opponent with those sacrifices, but the decks that play the combo use creature tutors like Chord of Calling that make it surprisingly easy to assemble this seemingly complex combo. The Geist is an important card in a deck that's been successful in Modern for about 5 years now, and it doesn't look like that's going to change, so it may move higher on the list in the future. At number 7, it's Westvale Abbey. It doesn't say Haste on this card right away, so bear with me for a moment. It's a land that can tap for colorless. You can also pay 5, tap it, and pay 1 life to make a 1/1 black human cleric token. And you can pay 5 generic and tap it and sacrifice 5 creatures to transform Westvale Abbey. And this is where Haste comes in, because it transforms into Ormondal Profane Prince, a 9/7 with not only Haste, but also flying, lifelink, and indestructible. The Haste here really matters because it would be clunky as heck if you went to the trouble of transforming this and then didn't get to attack with it right away. And because you do get to attack right away, it usually means you immediately smash in for 9 and gain 9 life, and that alone is enough to put most games out of reach. Utility lands are great since they produce mana when you need them to early, but then they can really impact the board. While this isn't that efficient at making tokens, the upside of a game-ending demon is no small thing. It gained most of its points in Standard, where it was played in sacrifice decks that could easily go wide with tokens and other bodies, and sacrifice all of them with ease, but it was also a pretty easy inclusion in just about any creature-heavy deck, since it was a colorless land that could be transformed to close out the game. So it also showed up in decks like White Weenie. It's also seen a bit of play in Modern, but it's really caught on in Pioneer in a big way just earlier this year. It's being played there in mono-white control decks that run lots of token-generating planeswalkers. These decks even recently got an upgrade thanks to Caretaker's talent, and are leaning even more into the token theme right now, so these decks always run a singleton Westvale Abbey. And it looks like for the first time in a while, the Abbey has a regular home in a format, so it might move higher on the list. At number 6, it's Questing Beast. I think there's a pretty good chance that most people first think of Questing Beast when they think of non-red creatures with haste. That is, if you remembered, it had it in its very, very dense text box. For 2 generic and 2 green, it's a 4/4 that also comes with Vigilance and Death Touch, can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, makes combat damage dealt by your creatures unpreventable, and when it does combat damage to an opponent, it also deals that much damage to a planeswalker that player controls. Haste is pretty important here, since it often enables the beast to get in for a hit on the opponent right away, which often kills a planeswalker too. Even if it can't get in for a hit between Death Touch and preventing small creatures from blocking it, your opponent is unlikely to come away feeling like they made a good trade. That incredibly crowded text box has made Questing Beast a very powerful card, one that's seen play in every single format it's ever been legal in, and that's not going to change. It's just so good at getting in for damage and killing planeswalkers, and those tend to be pretty important things. At number 5, it's Icarid. For 3 generic and a black, it's a 3/1 with haste, and at the end of your turn, you sacrifice it. That is obviously not a good card. But Icarid can also come back from your graveyard every single upkeep, provided you have another black creature in your graveyard to exile. So haste here is kind of like it is on Goryo's Vengeance. Icarid comes back and gets in for a swing, and then goes away again. But unlike some other versions of this effect, Icarid does not exile itself, it just gets sacrificed. So If you have a well-stocked graveyard and multiple Icarids in there, you can be sending in like 6 or 9 damage at your opponent every turn for no mana at all. Icarid benefited greatly from the introduction of the dredge mechanic in original Ravnica. Once it made its debut, it became easy to load up your graveyard for free, and as a result, Icarid decks ran wild and extended, especially in 2008, and it's continued to be a key card in dredge decks in both Legacy and Vintage, where it's pretty easy to dump huge chunks of your library into the graveyard, and in Vintage especially, you can easily send multiple Icarids at your opponent on turn 2. Icarid's going to continue to amass top 8s in the Eternal formats. It turns out getting multiple free creatures in play every turn is pretty great. At number 4, it's Craterhoof Behemoth. If you didn't think of questing beast first when you thought of non-red haste creatures, maybe you thought of the Behemoth. For 5 generic and 3 green, it's a 5/5 with haste that gives +X/+X and trample to all of your creatures when it enters, where X is a number of creatures you control. Notably, it grants +X/+X and trample to itself too, so it can definitely put its haste to good use. Basically, if you have a built-out board at all, Craterhoof Behemoth just kills your opponent. 8 mana is a pretty steep cost, but the decks that use the Behemoth over the years don't have much of a problem with it, since it shows up in decks that cheat it into play, or that are capable of producing tons and tons of mana. For example, in Standard, Craterhoof Behemoth was played in Reanimator decks, in Modern it's been played in Ramp, and in Legacy, where it's gained the most points by far, it's been played in Elf decks. Elves and the Behemoth combine really well together because so many of them make mana, and by the time you have enough in play to help you cast the Behemoth, the stats boost it offers will be more than enough to make your board lethal. Elf decks in Legacy also have access to Glimpse of Nature, which makes all of this go down in a single turn in most cases, since if you use elves that can tap other elves for mana, like Heritage Druid, you just draw your entire deck in a single turn because you cast so many elves until you eventually find the Behemoth and swing for lethal. Alternatively, you can also cast Natural Order to find it. Either way, the Behemoth is going to give you lethal damage in an elf deck, and it's going to keep gaining points in Legacy elf decks as a result. At number 3, it's Vengevine. For 2 generic and 2 green, it's a 4/3 with haste, and like Icarid, it's a haste creature that can come back from the graveyard. In this case, it returns when you cast a second creature spell in a turn. Unlike Icarid, it also stays in play after it comes back. It's done the most, by far, in graveyard-oriented decks in the non-rotating formats, when combined with creatures like Gravecrawler or Hogak, who can be cast from the graveyard. You can just dump your whole deck in your graveyard, cast those from your graveyard, and get back your Vengevines. Vintage has become its most frequent home of late, where it's played in Bazaar aggro decks. These decks are all about using Bazaar of Baghdad on turn 1 to draw and discard a bunch of cards. Among those discarded cards will be free madness creatures, like the Rootwalla duo, and that discard can also set up a free hollow one. And if Vengevine also happens to be in your graveyard, which it usually is, it'll be joining the party when you cast all those free creatures. The deck can do lethal quite easily on turn 2. Vengevine's going to keep fueling one of the best decks in Vintage while also seeing some play in Modern and Legacy, so it's going to keep on putting up points, but so are the cards in front of it. At number 2, it's Bloodghast. For 2 black mana, it's a 2/1 that can't block, and it has haste whenever your opponent has 10 or less life. If it's in your graveyard and you have a land enter the battlefield under your control, it returns directly to the battlefield. So yeah, it's sort of like Icarid and Vengevine, in that it can return directly to the battlefield for no mana at all. Unlike them, it doesn't always have haste, but having it when your opponent is at 10 or less is definitely nice, and that's often the time when haste can be at its most powerful. Bloodghast only saw some modest play in Standard. Extended would be where it would first see play in a deck that has made Bloodghast such a powerhouse, Dredge. As with Vengevine and Icarid, you can dredge away your whole library or otherwise mill yourself and then get Bloodghast back for free. It's filled this role in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage for a long time, and that's just going to continue. And at number 1, it's Reality Smasher. For 4 generic and a colorless mana, it's a 5/5 with trample and haste, and whenever it becomes a target of a spell an opponent controls, you counter that spell unless its controller discards a card. This card's name is pretty appropriate because it smashes in for a big hit every time it comes down, and even if your opponent manages to remove it, they have to 2-for-1 themselves. Still, when you first look at this card, it probably doesn't look that insane, but it's kind of like Fleetwheel Cruiser. It's strong because you can easily use fast mana to get the Smasher in play in the very early game, and it represents a very quick clock. While Mitra's Workshop doesn't work on a non-artifact, you can cast Eldrazi for big discounts thanks to Eldrazi Temple, Eye of Ugin, and more recently Ugin's Labyrinth. In Modern, it's been put into play early thanks to those 3 cards, although Eye of Ugin got banned for making Eldrazi too good, and Ugin's Labyrinth is a recent addition. That's without mentioning other colorless fast mana like City of Traders and Ancient Tomb, which help you put Eldrazi into play quickly in both Vintage and Legacy. Reality Smasher is going to keep on smashing Reality in all 3 non-rotating formats it's legal in, and it's likely to remain the #1 card on this list for the foreseeable future. So, those are the top 10 non-red cards with Haste. If you want to be able to attack with your creatures the turn they come down, even when you aren't playing red, then check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, including more that look at specific keyword abilities, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.